Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Writers Podcast. This is episode 48, and I have with me a returning guest, and that would be Ed Willett. Hello, Ed. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me back on.
Not a problem. The last time you were on was back in October 2020, and at that time you were pushing your 11th novel, The Moonlit World. Today we're looking at something else that you're working on. But why don't you, before we get into that, why don't you give everybody a little bit of a background about who you are and what you do?
Okay, well, this is the little potted bio that I use all the time, so it kind of rolls off my tongue.
Great.
I'm the award-winning author of more than 60 books of fantasy, science fiction, and nonfiction for readers of all ages. I also host the Aurora award-winning podcast, The Worldshapers, where I interview authors. Fancy that. Mm-hmm. And I'm also a publisher through Shadowpaw Press. So all those things. Primarily a writer, but I've gotten more and more into other stuff in the last little while, the podcasting and editing and publishing.
Right. And we did go over a lot of your background in the previous podcast, so I won't delve too deeply into that again. But primarily, you're a science fiction writer?
Primarily, although I write everything. I mean, I've been a full-time freelance writer now for coming up on 30 years. Mm-hmm. So although my first love is science fiction and fantasy, and I love writing fiction more than anything else, I've also done a ton of nonfiction and everything from children's books on various science topics to genetics demystified from McGraw-Hill to the history of the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Saskatchewan, which had the longest title of any of my books because it was called A Safe and Prosperous Future, 100 Years of Engineering Achievements in Saskatchewan. So,
wow.
So I do a lot of that kind of thing too. And, magazine articles, I've written plays. I'll write anything, preferably for a buck, but sometimes just for fun.
Right. Right. And as you've mentioned, you work primarily from home, correct?
Yes. As I said, a full-time freelancer now for 3 decades, just about.
Wow. So interestingly, your situation is probably reversed from most people who have to go to an office for a job because of what's been going on with COVID the last couple of years. And probably your only outlet or main outlet for social interaction was going to writing cons and things of that nature. Am I correct?
Yeah, I kind of missed that. Mm-hmm. Although right when it started, I was writer in residence at the Saskatoon Public Library. And the last 3 months of that, March, April, and May of 2020, or 2.5 months, I suddenly stopped going up to Saskatoon, which is a 2.5-hour drive north of here. Okay. And I would stay over one night, and I was in the office up there. And so I actually made more money because I suddenly didn't have all the expenses of travel, and I was doing all my writer in residence stuff remotely. But I did miss meeting people in person. And the main impact has been I haven't been obviously to a science fiction convention now. The last one I went to was World Fantasy Con in Los Angeles in 2019, and I haven't been to one since. They have been happening, but I haven't been to one.
Right. And how do you feel about going forward now? If there is a con coming up like next week, would you be comfortable in attending that? Or?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I'm going to be at Sask Expo, which is our provincial version of a Comic Con, manning a table in that's the end of April, so that's not too far away.
Yeah. Wow.
Our restrictions are lifted here, so it should be fairly normal. I mean, some people will wear masks and so forth, but there's no actual restrictions on it.
Right. Yeah. I know that primarily for me, I always go to When Words Collide in Calgary.
That's a good
August.
one, yeah.
Yeah, but unfortunately, they've already made the decision not to hold it again this year, so that'll be the 3rd year.
I know, and I'm one of the featured guests this year. It's like these 3 New York Times bestsellers and me. So one of these things is not like the others, I feel like, but it's an honor to be asked to do that. And they have told me they'll bring me back sometime in the future.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. And I hope that they'll do some sort of virtual con again this year.
Oh, yeah. That's already in the works for sure.
Yeah. So that was that was pretty good last year. There are some conveniences, of course. You don't have to travel and whatnot. You can go to your own bed at night. But
and the other thing about it is that you get people attending who otherwise wouldn't attend. So I do something called the 7 Sentence Short Story, which is actually a writing exercise created by James Van Pelt, a science fiction writer in the States. And I run it as like an hour-long fun workshop. And I did that online last year, and he was actually able to log in. And so he was there doing it with me running it. So you get those sort of cool things happening.
Yeah, for sure. So like, I don't know normally, how do you usually interact with other writers? And I guess your podcast is one venue that you use for getting that kind of interaction, but do you have like regular writers groups, or how does that work for you?
I've never belonged to an actual physical writing group because there just wasn't one. Well, there was one, but they were all, at the time, they were all elderly ladies writing about their experiences during the Depression. And my science fiction stuff just wasn't going to fit in there.
Right.
I was in Weyburn, where I grew up, little town in Saskatchewan.
Okay.
So no, I've never had any kind of real writing group that I met with regularly. So yeah, it's mostly been virtually, either at conventions or local literary events or book readings, that kind of thing, or just, email and all the stuff we do online.
And we probably covered this in the previous podcast, but I'm just curious, do you have like a writers? So you don't have a writing group or anything like that, but do you have beta readers?
I am one of the few, it seems these days, who, although I have talked to others who don't do it, I simply have never done that. When I started, everything was by mail. So I was part of a writing group by mail, but that was weeks. You'd send out something and it was weeks before it came back.
Right.
And so no, I write, like if I write a novel for Daw Books, the first person who sees it is the editor at Daw Books. And maybe I should, but there's that whole old dog, new tricks thing at this point. So
Right. Do you use any software like for checking your work when you're doing your drafts and edits? Writing aid, or?
I didn't used to, but because I'm doing a lot of editing now of other people's stuff, I do a lot of freelance editing as well. I find that Grammarly is helpful. I use it quite a bit. You have to check every single correct. I don't even touch the wordiness and all that stuff. I just use the correction to check for typos and punctuation and things like that. I do find that helpful. And then I have another one called Perfect It, which is a very high-end thing that's mostly checking for. One of the things that I have to worry about is that my Shadowpaw Press uses Canadian spelling. Everything I write in the States uses U.S. spelling. Some people I'm editing want to use U.S. spelling, and some want to use Canadian spelling. And this Perfect It is very good at making sure that you're consistent in your spelling, because it's very easy to overlook a color O-U-R or color O-R if you're just doing it by eye. So I do find software somewhat helpful.
Right. That's an interesting point about the spelling. What do you recommend for new writers starting out? Canadian writers, should they spell in the Canadian or American?
It depends on where you're going to submit it to, really. The U.S. publishers want U.S. spelling. Most Canadian publishers want Canadian spelling, but it's not a deal breaker either way. If you wrote in Canadian spelling and sent it to a U.S. publisher, they would just run it through software like I'm running it through, probably, to correct all that sort of thing. I would say you should write in whatever you're comfortable writing in, so you're not thinking about it.
Right. Okay. Very good. So let's turn to your podcast and I guess the related work that has come out of that. And your podcast is called Worldshapers, or The Worldshapers, I should say. And you've talked to a vast array of science fiction and fantasy authors. And from that, I guess you got the idea to do these anthologies?
Yeah, the podcast had started in August of 2018. And the reason it's called The Worldshapers partly is because I was starting a series with Daw Books called Worldshapers. And also because it was a good title for what I wanted to do. So it was kind of tied in at the same time. And so the podcast went along for a while. And because I had connections in the field, from going to conventions and meeting people, I was able to draw in some big names to talk to right off the bat. John Scalzi, Robert J. Sawyer, Tanya Huff, and Julie Cherneda were my first 4 guests. And later on, I was having like Victoria Schwab and Joe Haldeman and David Brin and people like that. Orson Scott Card. So I had all these authors, and then I also started the publishing company a bit before that in 2018, which made me a member of Sask Books, which is the Publishers Association here in Saskatchewan. I'm now vice president. And they had a presentation at the annual meeting in 2018 of this publisher from Winnipeg who had successfully kickstarted an anthology to the tune of $100,000. She had connections in the comics world, and they're really big on Kickstarters in comics. I think that's how that was so successful.
Right.
But I thought, I know some authors. And so I started thinking about it. Well, it took me a while because there was a learning curve when it came to running a Kickstarter, and it took me a while to pull the trigger on it, but I finally did. And in March of 2020. Now, what else happened in March of 2020? So I launched my first Kickstarter kicked off the Kickstarter in the pandemic at the same time. And I had 9 original stories and 9 reprints. And what I'd done was just ask my first-year guests. I had to cut it off somehow, so that was my dividing line.
Right.
And, again, I had really big names, original fiction from people like Shauna Maguire and Lee Modesitt Jr. and Tanya Huff and David Weber. And there were reprints then from Galsey and David Brin and Joe Haldeman and people like that, Fonda Lee. So it was successful. And I thought, well, let's do it again. So last year I did it again. And Shapers of Worlds Volume 2 came out in the fall because I successfully kickstarted it a year ago. It's bigger, has 24 stories in it. And again, there's people like Kelly Armstrong, James Allen Gardner, Matthew Hughes, Garth Nix, people like that in there, Barb Hambly and Nancy Kress. It just goes on and on. So I said, well, let's do it again. And so right now I'm running the Kickstarter for Volume 3, which features my third-year guest. And again, lots of, there's a bit of a mixture. I mean, I do talk to new authors as well.
Right.
And one of the nice things about it is that you get new authors who then appear in an anthology with some of these big names that they might never, appear with in an anthology otherwise.
Yep.
So I kind of enjoy that.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got in this one, I've got Kat Rambo in it, James Morrow, Cory Doctorow, F. Paul Wilson, and just another whole big slew of great authors.
Right. And does this... do these volumes, do they have a theme, each one of them, or are they just pretty wide open?
They do not. Well, they do in a way, but the theme is here's some stories that you might like.
Okay.
They're not
Good
themed
theme?
in the way a lot of anthologies are.
Right.
I used the metaphor in the last one. I called it a cabinet of curiosities, in the 18th century, these rooms that would have all these odds and ends that people had collected. And you could have everything from artwork to old books to fossils to interesting rock specimens.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the idea. It's an author's showcase is what it is. These are the stories that these authors, especially in the case of the reprints, that they wanted to see back in print. They wanted people to have a chance to read them. If they're new authors or original fiction, this is something that they wanted to write. I only rejected one that has come in so far, and they just gave me a different one. It's just that the one that was provided would have pushed me into the X-rated side of things. So I said, no, we're trying to keep it more like PG-13.
Right. Right.
So she gave me a different story.
Yeah, okay. Do you find the range of stories you're getting? Is this just science fiction and fantasy? Do you take or are there any horror stories or?
There are some that tinge into the horror. I consider that a form of fantasy.
Okay.
Depending on the type of horror, supernatural horror. There's definitely supernatural stories in here. The Kelly Armstrong story has verges on horror in a way.
Yeah, that's her field of play, right?
Yeah, the last one, there's one by Lisa Kessler, which is supernatural, not exactly horror though.
Mm-hmm.
Tim Pratt, a little bit. So there's some elements of that. I haven't had anything that really is flat out horror, I don't think. The Kelly Armstrong's probably the closest. Mm-hmm. But if I had an author that was what they wrote and that was what they gave me, and again, within that sort of keeping it in a PG-13 sort of level,
right,
that would be fine.
Sure.
As long as it's fantastical in some way. That's really
yes.
what
And
I'm looking for.
I assume you're the editor of this collection.
I am the editor, yes.
And
I read them all
yes,
over and over and over.
And how do you find that process? Is it pretty
I enjoy
straightforward?
editing. Well, it is. I mean, I'm working with professional, experienced writers.
Right.
They're the easiest to work with.
Mm.
And there's not usually that much to be done.
Right.
There's some stylistic things. One thing is I'm changing all these American authors into Canadian spelling. So I do a lot of that. And just here and there's a question or something that doesn't make sense. And
right.
the authors are always very quick to take care of it. So it's been a pleasure to edit all these people.
Right, right. So again, coming back to the spelling thing, you mentioned that you're changing it all to Canadian spelling. So is that the only version of the book that you release, or is there also like an American
Nope.
spelling version?
It's published by Shadowpaw Press. Shadowpaw Press is a Canadian press, and I made the decision with my very first book, which was my short stories, which I had to change to Canadian spelling. They'd all been written if I was sending them out to U.S. markets.
Right, right.
I just made that decision early on, and I've stuck with it. I mean, I am Shadowpaw Press. The state, c'est moi.
Yep.
But I could change that at a moment's notice, but my intention is to stick to that.
And you must oversee all stages of the publishing of the book. Do you do book covers and whatnot as well? Or do you have somebody that does that for you?
In this particular case, the cover art, there's some really fine science fiction art available through various stock sources. And because these are generic, I was able to find some really fine art. I've used the same artist for all three of them. I don't even know if it's a he or she, actually. Tithi Luodthang is the name. And his work is available on Shutterstock. And I've used his work for all three, which gives them a nice unified look. And his artwork is just very evocative and works great for these particular books. For the other Shadowpaw Press books, I've done various things. Sometimes I've used some other Shutterstock images. I've commissioned art a couple of times. I'll do more of that going forward as I publish other people.
Right.
And as I get, hopefully, some grant money which is available here in Saskatchewan for book publishing, will enable me to do more of that. So it depends on what I feel suits the particular book. But I generally do the actual cover layout, as in choosing the text and all of that sort of stuff. Whatever image I have, I usually do the text.
And for the actual formatting and publishing of the book, do you use Amazon services, or do you have a tool set that you use for that? Or
mostly I've used Vellum, which is a Mac-only software that does a great job on formatting ebooks and print books. There's a new one out called Atticus, which gives a wider variety of stuff, which I'll probably be using going forward for book design. So I have those software tools. When it came to publishing, they've been done differently. The first one, I piggybacked on the distribution of a local publisher, Radiant Press, and it was distributed by Lit Disco, which is a Canadian distribution company. And for that, I did get a book production grant from Creative Saskatchewan for that. So I did an actual print run. They're always actual print runs, but a larger print run. That was okay, but I didn't like the fact that it kept showing up as being published by Radiant Press instead of me, because the metadata was kind of confused.
Right.
So for the second one, I went with print on demand through Ingram, but I always do a separate Amazon version so that it always shows as in stock on Amazon. So they're functionally identical, but they're actually slightly different. And then on ebooks, I distribute them every which way I can think of.
Right.
So it is widely distributed. It's not just on Amazon by any means.
Right. Just a little tangent here, if you don't mind. I'm sure you're aware of the Kickstarter sensation that just happened with Brandon Sanderson.
Yes.
You must look at that and shake your head.
Well, he's Brandon Sanderson, so
right.
He's built that audience through traditional publishing. He's built that audience. And so when, he has enough people that for whatever I don't know what his number was, but you get four new novels from Brandon Sanderson for not that much money, and he's got thousands of fans, it adds up quickly.
Yeah.
So I don't begrudge it at all. I was on a panel with Brandon once. He's a nice guy.
Yeah. I'm kind of sitting back and watching with interest the reaction from other writers and that, and there's a lot of hyperbole about this is going to change publishing and that, but I think you touched upon it a bit in your answer. Is this is not an overnight thing that just happened for him. For Brandon Sanderson, he's curated a fan base over the last, I don't know how long he's been writing now, 15 years or whatever. So, and he did a smaller trial run with those special edition books that he did last year as well on Kickstarter. So I don't see this phenomenon happening very often. That you really have to be in the proper position to get that kind of response, I think.
If you go way back, I remember Stephen King experimenting with the ebook.
Yeah, the lottery or the plant. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was, the same kind of surge, but he's Stephen King.
Right.
So and I'm sure there's lots of, and I read somebody commenting on this, there's, authors thinking, oh, I'll do a Kickstarter and I'll make all this money. Well, let me tell you, having run 3 of them.
Yes.
With these big names I have attached to these anthologies,
yep,
it's still not a shoe-in. You have to really work hard to get the word out and make that. And I'm just looking for a few $1,000s. So
yeah,
I will probably run a Kickstarter for my own fiction. I'm looking at that to carry on a couple of my series that have that Daw's not carrying on. I would like to carry on.
Right.
But I'm not expecting 21 million or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It would be really nice, but
yeah, for sure. And And you just have to kind of like shake your head a little bit. Like, this guy's output is already prodigious. Like, he's writing these epic length fantasy novels. And then here over this COVID thing, he writes 4 extra books. It's like,
yeah,
how does
I wish my
it?
fiction writing brought in that kind of money so that was all I had to do. I could write 4 books.
Yeah.
I could write 4 books in a year if that was all I had to do. But, there's this whole making money and making a living thing that keeps me doing lots of other things on the side.
Yeah. But the thrust of this whole thing is that, and this you're doing, Kickstarter is a viable option for independent self-publishing writers, for sure.
Well, and it's the only way I could do this, because I was not interested in and I wouldn't even have offered. I was not interested in publishing these authors unless I could offer them professional rates.
Right.
And admittedly, professional rates in science fiction fantasy aren't that huge anyway. But I'm offering 10 cents a word Canadian for original fiction and 5 cents a word for reprints, which goes up if I overfund. For every $5,000 I overfund on this one, I'll raise it a cent, which would be nice. But just that, this last book was 144,000 words. So even taking out the reprints, call it 100,000 words of new fiction at 10 cents a word. Well, that's $10,000 right there.
Right.
It was actually more than that. So you have to have a big chunk of money to commit to a project like this. And the only way I was going to get that was through Kickstarter. And at least through Kickstarter, nobody gives you money unless they like the project. So it's not like you're getting it from anywhere else. It's coming from people who really want what you're doing, which is always nice to know as well. Right.
And I'll put a link up in the show notes about where people can go to find out more information about your Kickstarter. I'm looking here right now, it's running for another 22 days, which I guess brings it to April 1st or something like that?
April 5th, I think.
April 5th. So for anybody out there that's interested in this anthology, there's a lot of great writers attached to it, as Ed has mentioned already. Will the book be available in various formats? Is it primarily just an ebook, or?
The ebook is the most popular in the commercial, and also on the Kickstarter itself. I probably get more ebook backers than I do trade paperback backers.
Right.
But yeah, it'll be available in ebook, trade paperback, and hardcover as well. I think I've sold 2 hardcovers, but it is there.
Okay.
And probably not audiobook. Audiobook is not big. Short stories apparently aren't big in audiobooks.
Oh, okay. Interesting, because the audiobook market is really exploded.
Yeah, I do have those rights. Occasionally an author will withhold the audiobook rights, in which case I don't have those rights for one of the authors.
That makes
I still could do audiobooks, but that's just, again, it's just me and the cat, and he's no help.
Oh, come on, cat, pull your weight.
His name is on the press, and his picture's on every book, but he's no help at all.
Oh, well, I guess his image is helping promote the whole books. Is this a line of books that you hope to do annually? Is that what your current pace is? Or?
Yeah, one a year, as long as I keep the podcast going, and I'm well into my 4th year. Already booking ahead now into May or something, and August will be the end of the 4th year. So assuming this one funds, and I have every reason to think it will, it's still a long way to go, and it's 63% or something like that already.
Okay. Well,
I would anticipate doing Shapers of Worlds Volume 4 next year, and if I keep doing the podcast, maybe Volume 5 the year after that. We'll see.
Okay. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed for you. What about your own projects, your solo works? What have you got going on there?
I have a novel coming out from DAW in the fall called The Tangled Stars, which is a humorous far future space opera. There's actually my story in Shapers of Worlds Volume 2, because I always put one of my own stories in, is actually a prequel to it set 10 years before the novel, and introduces the 3 characters, one of whom is, in fact, a cat, artificially enhanced and genetically modified cat, who, bit of a spoiler, but in the novel, he eventually ends up as captain of the starship. So,
oh, wow.
So I've had a lot of fun with him. So that's coming out this fall in some format. And after that, so I would like to continue that as a series. It's kind of the start of a potential series there, but we'll see. And then I have shopping around a couple of things. I have a middle grade novel I've been looking for a home for that I might end up bringing out myself. And I'm working on a YA novel that was supposed to be published by a publisher that went out of business. And I'm thinking, well, darn it, I'm going to finish it anyway.
Right.
And all that sort of thing. So there's always projects going on, but the only definite novel I have coming out in the near future will be The Tangled Stars this fall.
Mm-hmm. And beyond your Saskatchewan Comic-Con appearance, do you have anything else lined up?
Nothing definite. I'll be looking at World Fantasy and World Science Fiction this year. World Science Fiction is in Chicago, which is a great place. We've been there the last time they had science fiction convention there. New Orleans for World Fantasy would be really cool. I've only ever been there once, and that was back in the 70s.
Right.
But, there's other things to consider, timeline and funding and all that sort of stuff. So I can't say for sure. And when Words Collide, I'll be there virtually as one of the guests of honor.
Right. All right. Very good. I'll look forward to seeing some of your presentations.
Thank you.
And I think that's all the questions I had. Is there anything else you'd like to mention that hasn't come up yet?
I think I have blabbed on a lot. Maybe, I guess you'll have links to stuff, but Shadowpaw Press is just at shadowpawpress.com. There will be new books coming out from it that I'm now starting to publish from other authors, some that were also orphaned by other publishers is one line of books I'm doing, including a science fiction novel called Duotero by Brad C. Anderson will be coming out pretty soon. Then I have new work, one of whom is by Matthew Hughes, but not science fiction, although he's well known as a science fiction author. I'm publishing a YA novella of his this fall.